So in the past few lectures, we learned a bit about some of the basics in D3. In this lecture, we'll learn something called data join, which is how D3 intakes and renders data on the screen. This is one of the most, if not the most important aspects to understand in D3. And once you get through this, you'll pretty much be able to do anything in D3. So let's start with some basics first. So I'm going to create a scale. And I'm going to give its domain from 1 to 5. Remember, the domain is the data space. And range from, let's say, 0 to 200. Remember, range is the pixel space. Okay. Also, let's insert an SVG element into our object model through D3. Let's see how that works. So D3 can actually handle, add, remove all kinds of elements from the screen. Sometimes you might want to do it this way, sometimes you might not, depending on how you set up your project. But let's see how we can add a new SVG element onto our DOM using D3. So by this statement, it selects the body and appends an SVG element. So you can append any element here. I want SVG, so I'll append SVG. And then SVG has attributes height 250, width 250. Okay. So now we have our basic element in the basic element in the DOM setup. Now we want to do is render some data on it. So let's say I have a very simple data set, which is an array of values, and I want to color code those values, see how that reacts in D3. So I'll just have a function, takes the data and takes a color that you want to represent, and let's see how the rendering looks like. So if I want to render data, for example, 1, 2, 3, with the color, let's say, red, and then I want to change the data, so I'll just call that function again, and I want to render data 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 with the color, let's say, blue. So these are the 3 and 5 data points. Remember, we cannot go more than 5 because our domain is from 1 to 5. It will cause weird errors, but it will wrap around if you go above 5. So to render the data, first we need to select. So with D3, it has the concept of don't tell the data what to do, but bind the data with the objects and tell the objects what to do. So I'm going to type the code and I'll explain it how it works. So I want the data to be represented as rectangles. So here I create a rectangles variable and I select from the SVG element, which I created here, I select all rectangles, but there aren't any rectangles present in the SVG right now. That is correct, but how D3 works is when you give it the data element, it would render the data into these rectangles once it sees how many data points there are and how to work through them. And then you can give D3 how to enter those elements into the SVG tag. So for example, so when SVG is entering these elements, when D3 is entering these elements as rects into the SVG, I want to do this part. So I want to, at each enter, I want to append a rectangle. I want to give it a couple attributes. So x is scale. Remember the scale we created here? That's how the x coordinate will be decided. Y will be just 50, so in a straight line. And width is, let's say, 20. Height is also, let's say, 20. And then fill. Oh. So let's just run it with 1 and see what happens. So it gives out 3 red rectangles, which is what we kind of expected. So what D3 does is it takes this rectangle variable, and the rectangle variable maps all the data points into rect. It selects all the rectangles in the SVG element and maps all the data points to these rects. Now, well, the rect needs to know how to enter new elements, because initially the data set that the D3 has on the SVG element is empty, but it's trying to enter 1, 2, and 3 elements in it. So to enter, we need to tell D3 how to enter new elements. So we tell it, hey, enter. For enter, you need to append a rectangle with these attributes. That's exactly what it does. It creates 3 rectangles with color red that comes from here, and with all these attributes. Now let's say I want my data changed. So instead of the data being 1, 2, 3 right now, the data is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Let's see what happens. So if I refresh it, the first 3 elements are still red, and the last 2 that it showed up were blue. But I kind of wanted all of mine blue. Why did it not change the color of these 3 blue? The reason for that is how D3 appends new data elements is it sees the first element's already present on the screen, so it doesn't touch it. The second element is also already present on the screen, so it doesn't touch it. The third element is also present, so it doesn't touch it. The fourth and fifth one are the new elements. So as it enters those elements into your SVG tag, that's when it colors them blue. So the first 3 elements, even though they're present, SVG doesn't touch them because it thinks that you're not entering those elements, but you're kind of updating those elements, which is what we want. And for that, we have another tag called merge. So what merge does is, when entering new elements, it merges the attributes that you want to enter into the elements that already exist and the ones that you're entering currently new. So it'll be easier if I show you how it works. So when I merge, for example, these 2 new elements, what I want to do is I want to merge them into the rects variable, and now whatever happens after merge happens to all the elements that have already been present and that have entered newly. So the elements that have entered newly and the ones that are already present, I want to change their x value first, and then the color. The reason for changing the x2 is because when new elements are entered, I want their domain to be mapped to their respective range. So let's see what happens now. Okay, so now all of them are blue, but if I back it up a little bit, if I do it without the merge, half of them it's going to be 3 reds and 2 blues because the 2 elements are being added newly. Also, as we exit, so for example, if there are less data points and the new data set contains more data points than what previously had, the new data points are entered and merged into the old data set. But for example, let's say if this function was rendered before, now the previous data set has more data points than the new data set. So let's see what it does right now. So as we can see, like the first element had 5 blue and the new elements had 3 red. But for some reason in the new data set we didn't have these 2 data points, but in the representation D3 still presents these 2 points. The reason for that is, although we have told D3 how to enter and how to merge new elements, we haven't told D3 what happens to the elements that get dropped. So another function for that's really important is rex exit remove. So rex exit tells D3 that, okay, when my elements are exiting, do everything that comes after me. So, but just what I want to do is I want to remove those elements. So let's see what happens now. So now as I remove those 2 elements, as I remove those 2 data points in my data set, those 2 elements get removed too. But you can add other attributes to it. For example, let's say the elements that get removed, I want to color them yellow. So let's see what that works. So I don't want to remove them, but I want to color them yellow. Let's see what this does. So now the two new elements that were supposed to be dropped, they don't get dropped, but they're colored yellow. Ideally, what happens in real life data sets is you kind of want to remove those elements, but just an example, you can do a lot more with the elements just other than just removing them. So this is, if you understand this, data join is one of the most important concepts in D3. You can append as many attributes as you want here, and with exit too. You can really build beautiful data maps and other things using just these simple concepts. So I'll show you guys an example. For example, this is something I just made like 20 minutes ago. So all this is using is enter, merge, and exit. But now, if you would notice closely, as the new elements are entered, they are dropped from above and their color is green. They are merged into the current line of elements as they change their position. So the new elements come in a already set position, but the merged elements get their positions changed. And as the letters are dropped, they go down and then they're removed. So I'm using something called transition, which is it transitions from 0 to fade. It transitions the opacity of the letters from 1 to 0, which basically means it's completely opaque, to 0, which means it is invisible. Doing this is not that hard. It's just you have to have some CSS knowledge and HTML knowledge, but the concepts just build up on enter, merge, and exit.